Steve Eisman was the guy who had this big bet, this big short, if you like, against US residential mortgage-backed security market. So, people's mortgages, which were supposed to be these rock-solid investments, they were told. And he made a lot of money betting that they would collapse in 2008.
Right.
And the story that's just come out in the media this week is that Eisman's latest big short, if you like, is against the UK economy. So Steve Eisman's had a series of bets against, in particular, the UK retail sector, so high street, large retail outlets. And what he said is that if Jeremy Corbyn is elected leader of the Labour Party, which looks increasingly likely with the fracture in the Tory party over Brexit, that he's going to increase his short position in the future.
I heard about that. I heard about that. They said, again, I heard about this in the Evening Standard, and I think possibly the Times. They basically said that Steve Eisman said, I know my Trotskyites very well. Jeremy Corbyn is a Trotskyite, and that's why I'll be betting against the UK. But you can add something to that, can't you?
Well, that sounds about right. I think it's interesting they are trying to kind of pin the structural decline of the retail sector on Jeremy Corbyn. What we're talking about here over the last decade has been, the rise of Amazon, online retail. This has kind of ripped the guts out of the high street, to say nothing of a decade of conservative austerity policies. So, the high street is in decline for a significant number of reasons, most of which have nothing to do with the policies of the Labour Party, which is an opposition, not government, let's remind ourselves. But it's interesting that, that the likes of Financial Times appear to be getting their excuses in early for the next collapse by kind of trying to blame this on Jeremy Corbyn when the guy is not even in power. A large number of local authorities borrowing money from government, and what they've been doing is they've been investing that money into commercial retail, into shopping malls, into office space.
Well, are there rules? Are there rules when a council borrows money from a bank? Do they have to say what they're borrowing it for?
They do not. So, what we have is what I would label a speculator's charter, where the councils have basically got 3 years to do anything they like with money they borrow prior to putting it to any sort of social use. This is called borrowing in advance of need. So effectively, the local authority doesn't need to tell you why it's borrowing money.
When you say you, do you mean you the taxpayer, or you the bank, or what?
Well, they don't need to tell the local residents that are actually paying and underwriting this stuff why they're going to either the bank or to the government to borrow money. So they're effectively expecting their taxpayers to take on financial risk, and nobody in the local community is none the wiser in terms of what that local authority is actually
okay,
doing.
And then just before you go any further, are there... Because this is a story of financial deregulation, and yet these terms are so loaded that nobody really understands what they mean. So just to keep it really clear, are there any rules when a council borrows money from a bank? Are there any rules at all, apart from the fact that they have to repay the bank? Do they, what are the rules? Is anybody overseeing these loans?
So there are rules, but there's nobody to enforce the rules.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean.
So what I mean is that there is guidance. So there is documents which councils should have regard to, they should read, they should consider when making borrowing and investment decisions. The people who create those rules are called the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, which is basically a private body which has a royal charter.
SIPFA, isn't it? They're known as SIPFA.
Which sets... Right. SIPFA, precisely. So they kind of set the framework for council borrowing and investment, but they have no real kind of regulatory or enforcement powers. So they can, set the mood music. They can kind of, give councils a steer in terms of, is this appropriate, is it not? But when it actually comes down to it, if the council does something wrong, SIPFA can't really do too much about
Okay,
it.
before we go any further, so we're talking about councils getting into debt, borrowing money from banks, and you're saying, I said, are there rules or are there no rules? And you're saying there are rules, but at the same time, there's no one to enforce them. So just before,
Well, as I'll give you an example. In 2008, the last financial crisis, 127 local authorities lost a combined £1 billion in Icelandic banks. Now, a lot of the finance officers of those councils had been clearly kind of speculating and taking significant financial risk without really considering what the consequences might be. Many had flouted SIPFA and local government rules. They'd use money which was ring fenced for schools and other purposes to go and gamble on high interest rates in Iceland. And when they lost that money and it was frozen, all that happened was that 4 council officers out of the 127 were disciplined. Maybe they were had their membership of SIPFA paused for a year. It's not like they were actually prosecuted for failure of duty in the public interest.
So there was a whole wave. There was a whole wave of councils where they were borrowing money, and then afterwards using the money that they were borrowing to do high risk investments for high returns in Iceland, and they lost a lot of money.
Correct.
Okay.
They lost £1 billion
10 years ago.
Yeah. This was October 2008, so yeah, almost exactly 10 years ago.
Okay, and then you said just 4 people had a bit of a slap on the wrist.
Precisely. So I mean, take from that as you will, but that has been probably the largest financial scandal in local government finance, with the possible exception of Hammersmith and Fulham in the 80s.
What's the Hammersmith and Fulham?
Basically, no one lost their job.
What's the Hammersmith and Fulham?
The Hammersmith and Fulham case was basically local authorities speculating using interest rate swaps. So kind of similar to what Greece did when it tried to hide its debt to get into the Eurozone. They took out interest rate swaps thinking they could make some money by guessing which way rates might go.
So an interest rate swap is... So what is that exactly? Is that a gamble where you say, I think interest rates are going up or down or something like that?
I mean, it can be seen as a gamble if it's not attached to any particular borrowing. So, for example, if you had a loan and you wanted to make sure you were paying a fixed interest rate, you could take out a swap to effectively fix the rate. But if your interest rate swap is not attached to any underlying borrowing, it's just a pure speculative instrument, then in that case it would clearly be speculative as opposed to what some people might consider hedging, i.e. trying to make sure no matter what happens to interest rates you don't lose out. And so what some of these councils have been doing, I would definitely argue would fall into the kind of speculation category rather than how do we kind of manage interest rate risk of rates going up or down.
Well, it sounds to me as though the banks are quite clever, and it's to do with wording and stuff like that, the fine line between somebody doing really dangerous behaviour and someone doing something really sensible. Is that fair for me to say that?
I mean, what the banks are very good at is regulatory arbitrage. So this is how do we engineer around particular restrictions which are put in place ostensibly to protect the customer, in this case, local councils and the taxpayers who ultimately have to pay their liabilities. And so in the Hammersmith case I just mentioned, after that, because councils got burnt, it was deemed to be ultra vires or illegal for councils to do deals involving derivatives. And so what councils like Newham have done, what banks have done to sell derivatives to councils like Newham, is to actually take derivatives, embed them into a loan, and sell them. So it was illegal to do a standalone derivative contract, but if you hide them inside a loan, that was perhaps a kind of grey area. Maybe it's legal, maybe it's not. Let's just kind of sell a few and kind of see how it goes. And so the banks were basically able to sell £16 billion of these loans to local authorities across the UK without anyone really having to make a determination as to whether or not those loans were actually legal.
Okay, so just to clarify, it's one thing to borrow money, but then these derivatives are supposedly like insurance products that go with the loans. And they're separate, but then what happened was people were buying the insurance on its own as a bet on interest rates, and that was illegal. Became illegal. So then afterwards people ended up borrowing money with these derivative stroke insurance products embedded within the loans.
That's about right, yeah. So the derivatives, the insurance, if you like, itself was illegal. So the banks hid it inside the loan in ways which were not transparent and not clearly understood by the customer.
Okay, and so when they embedded these derivatives that on their own were illegal, these insurance products that were on their own illegal, when they put them in there, then was there much room to maneuver for the banks in terms of structuring these derivatives so that they could either be a very good deal for the local authority or in some cases a very bad deal? This is what we're talking about.
Yes, what the banks were able to do, if you like, was embed a series of options into these loans. And these loans, for example, could be 60 or 70 years long, very extremely long duration. And every 6 months or so, the bank could have an option to increase the interest rate. And so the bank sold you the loan on the basis you'd pay, say, 4.5%. But in 6 months' time, the bank could come back to you and say, well, actually, look, market conditions have changed. Maybe we now see you as a higher credit risk. We're going to increase your interest rate to 5%. And all the council could do in that situation was either repay the loan in full or agree to the higher interest rate and pay 5% rather than 4.5%. So what these things actually did was create a whole series of refinancing risk for the local authority. And additionally, if interest rates fell, which is what's happened since 2008 with the crisis, the breakage cost or the cost of exiting these loans absolutely snowballed. So the breakage cost on a LOBO loan is more than double in some cases, the face value of a loan. So if you borrowed £10 million, it would probably end up costing you more than £20 million to buy your way out of a loan. And that's because these derivatives create refinancing risk, which, depending on what happens to interest rates, can end up costing you an awful lot of money. And so the risk of these loans is significantly greater than if you just borrow directly from government, which is what councils has historically done. Okay,
so it sounds like a bit of a... Are they all lose-lose for the councils?
There's kind of three scenarios you can point to. And so basically interest rates go up, in which case the bank increases the rate. Interest rates can go down, in which case you're stuck paying a higher rate of interest, but the market rate's dropped, which is what's happened. Or there's kind of like a third option in which rates stay basically as they were when you took out the loan, in which case you might just break even. So in 2 out of the 3 scenarios, you're going to lose quite a lot of money. And in the third scenario, which is very unlikely, you could come out of it just about okay. So most councils are going to lose an awful lot of money on these loans. As an example, Newham Council are paying an extra £10 million every year for as much as the next 50 years because they borrowed from the banks rather than from governments. We're talking about huge amounts of public money here.
So £10 million a year for the next 50 years. So that sounds like it's £500 million. It's
about right.
Okay, so what's going on then? So you said we agree that there are rules, but no one enforces them. There's no one checking whether or not any of this is fair, and all of these councils are taking out different loans at different interest rates, and it sounds like a mess. So what to do?
Yeah, it is a complete mess. The people who lose, of course, are local citizens who have to pay increased council tax, which rather than funding services is actually just going straight into the city to repay these loans to banks. In terms of what to do about it, the key point to make here is that these loans were never sold in the council's interest. So the banks made extortionate profits when these loans were sold, and part of that profit was basically kind of shared with the financial advisors to the local authority, who recommended to the council to go into these things. So these are companies like Capita, who is the biggest outsourcing company in the UK and advised something like 250 town councils how to manage their finance. And so basically what was happening was Capita was getting paid under the table something like £25,000, a share of £25,000, each time a local authority borrowed via a LOBO loan from a bank rather than borrowing from the usual source of funds, which is the UK government. And so the course of action for these local authorities to escape these things is to go after their advisors. Capita or Butlers was the other firm, which was a subsidiary of ICAP, run by a sort of city grandee called Michael Spencer. So they could be suing their advisors, or they could be going directly to the bank and say, look, these things were never in our interest. They were possibly illegal because of the Hammersmith ruling, and therefore we want to get after them, and we're not going to pay these extortionate breakage fees.
So hold on. So you're talking about perverse incentives where these loans have been made because the advisors to the councils told them you should do it, but at the same time those advisors were getting a commission for these loans being made.
Precisely. I mean, I would probably term these things facilitation payments because, firstly, the sums involved were extremely large. So in some cases, the brokers on these deals were being paid more than £100,000 for the council to take out a loan.
How do you know that?
And a huge slice of several ways. I mean, we've got information back via Freedom of Information Act requests from the council, which kind of show the payments the councils were making to the brokers.
Really? So what you've seen the invoices, you've seen the actual paperwork for the you've actually seen the documentation for the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And as one example, I mean, in one case, the broker was asking the council to pay a sum of over £100,000 commission to enact kind of two loan agreements. In this case, the council was able to negotiate the broker down to £50,000, but the fact that they were asking for such an extortionate amount of money just kind of goes to show, how much money it was possible for these kind of brokers.
So that means the broker is making more money than the bank, or no, or upfront.
No, it doesn't. It means the bank is making so much money on these loans, they're able to pay extortionate commissions. They're able to rip so much profit out of a local authority, they're able to reward the broker and the advisor far more than would be typically the case. So what's normal in the market is that if you borrow, you pay a commission, and that commission goes to the broker who's in the middle of a deal. On these LOBO loans, the broker was being paid on two sides of the deal. They were being paid from a local authority, the borrower, and they were being paid these supersized commissions from a lender, the bank. And so on both sides, they were getting these fat commissions, which were in some cases enough to raise internal red flags at banks like Barclays. And so what they had to do was split the commission up over kind of 2 or 3 days. And so no one in the compliance unit of the bank cottoned on to the fact that they were ripping so much profit out from their clients. And so
did you hear that? Did you hear that from the whistleblower Rob Carver?
I did indeed, yes. I mean, Rob has kind of pointed this out and said, look, I mean, this guy was around in Barclays between 2003, 2004, when this kind of market really got going. He was selling these things to councils and housing associations, and he left after about sort of, less than 18 months into the job, because he sort of felt essentially the people on the other side of these deals, town councils, housing associations, had no idea the risks they were taking and how much profit the bank was making on the deals.
Okay, so we've covered what these things are. We've covered the conflicts of interest so far. We've said that there are rules, but nobody applies them. Straight question. Obviously, we've discussed this in the past, but just to find out from you, what are the top brass of the Labour Party saying about this? Have you ever received a comment from them on this topic?
I mean, yeah, there's been some interaction for sure.
I've never heard
John
anything.
McDonnell,
I mean, I've heard a little bit, but not much.
Well, I mean, there's been a couple of interactions. So John McDonnell signed a letter on this issue to the Treasury Select Committee, to Andrew Tyree, which was sent, I believe, in March 2016. And that letter was basically calling for an inquiry into how these loans were sold, who was involved, how much profit was made, whether any kind of crimes were committed when these things were sold because of these conflicts of interest I've just set out, and the fact that these loans were all kind of pegged to the LIBOR interest rate, which the banks that were selling them, like Barclays and RBS, have all been involved in rigging. And so for a whole series of reasons, we asked kind of Treasury to go away and look at this, and never received a response from Andrew Tyree or the Treasury Select Committee. And so John McDonnell signed that letter. There's been a little bit of engagement both before and since, but I mean, admittedly not much. And I kind of get the sense, generally speaking, that it was only really the bankruptcy of Northamptonshire County Council in January, February of this year that really kind of put the issue back on the agenda. So Northamptonshire has £150 million in Lobos. On one of them, they're paying 11.5% interest to HSBC.
Hold on. When was that? When was that signed?
It was actually... Well, so just to clarify, so the part of the reason they're paying such a high interest rate was because that was a historical loan from the kind of late 1990s when background interest rates were quite.
But it's still high though. It's still high even for them, I think.
But the fact, it's extraordinary. I mean, at current rates are less than 2%. So you've got to ask yourself, why is it that they haven't cancelled this loan, paid a penalty on it to escape, and are now paying 1.82% from the Public Works Loan Board instead of lining the pockets of HSBC. Additionally, RBS, they've got a loan where they're paying over 7%, and that was signed in 2009 when rates were pretty close to zero.
Really?
And so, it's only the fact that these councils are now going bankrupt that we're getting across the board much more engagement from most political parties. And so, as an example, Barclays has been forced to cancel a huge chunk of its LOBO loans to councils and housing associations, about £5 billion, and they've been forced to convert those loans into a fixed rate. Now, this is being spun by the bank as a victory for their clients. In effect, it's really not, because they're still paying the same high interest rate. It's just that the bank doesn't have the option to increase it in future. So you're still being shafted. It's just the case that you're not going to get it any worse in future, which is cold comfort when you're paying 6 or 7% on a loan to Barclays like Newham is. And so what we're now seeing, however, is other banks following suit. So RBS struck a deal with Kent County Council a couple of weeks back. They were allowed to cancel and repay a few LOBO loans with RBS. They were paying over 4%. They could refinance at 2.1%, so now paying half the interest rate. Additionally, Northamptonshire, which I just mentioned, they've been able to pay to escape several of the RBS loans. And so I guess what we're now going to start seeing, we hope, is other councils around the country taking advantage of this and saying, look, why is it that when we're cutting literally everything in our budget, we can still justify repaying interest rates at sort of 11, 7, even 6% when the market rate is around 2%. And so, in the context of austerity, where they're pinching pennies everywhere from their budget, I just find it extraordinary that they haven't cottoned on to this issue much more quickly, because, we've been slashing council budgets since 2010, and it's only when the first one goes bankrupt they start thinking, oh, well, maybe we're paying too much for this historical borrowing, let's do something about it. So for me, it really strikes to the power imbalance between banks and the financial sector and local authorities who, let's face it, the city have over a barrel.
Right. So what's next then? I mean, I think we sort of saw that, there's a lot of councils that are taking the banks to court because Barclays were rigging LIBOR and they had these loans out there and there was a link to LIBOR on some of the loans.
That's right. There are 15 councils who are suing Barclays, so that includes Newham Council, also Leeds, Bristol, Manchester, Newcastle, and a few others. They are taking Barclays to court because of the relationship between rigging LIBOR interest rates, and those councils paying a higher rate of interest.
Are they all Labour councils?
Now, most of them are, not all of them. So there were a couple of Tory councils that I forget which ones, but yeah, there are, I think, one or two Tory councils who initially, at least.
So I take it that Kent, which is a Tory council, a very Tory council, I take it that they're not doing any suing.
They are not for the time being. They probably should have been, and given the financial trouble the council's in, yeah, you could definitely be making the case that, you know, it's a dereliction of duty, I would say, when there is essentially a kind of no win, no fee, essentially, you know, no cost option to sue the bank to recover effectively stolen money from your local residents, that council's not pursuing this. And so I think that the next opportunity in terms of the next 6 months is going to be RBS. And I would expect there to be a series of kind of legal actions around RBS kicking off between now and February of next year.
Okay, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about in relation to this?
I think, yeah, I mean, the main things are just the fact that, yeah, more local authorities should be looking at pursuing legal action. I mean, I've heard anecdotally, when I was in Parliament Tuesday night with some residents from Barnet, they were holding an inquiry into Capita, which is sort of called, pitched as Kick Out Capita. Capita was the financial advisor to the council. It also eventually ended up taking over about 2/3 of council services in Barnet in a huge outsourcing deal that has basically unravelled with an enormous kind of fraud being unearthed within the local authority.
When was that? I've never heard of that. When did the actual fraud thing come out?
So the fraud has happened over the last couple of years. I mean, Grant Thornton, one of the audit firms, have been brought in to do an inquiry into that fraud. They've just published a report which essentially found that the internal controls that were supposed to be in place to prevent malfeasance, fraud, abuse of public position were wholly lacking within the local authority. And this was something, you know, Capita, who is effectively running the council, should have been across. And so they created a perfect enabling environment for fraud to occur. And so what the local residents are now pushing for is for that contract to be cancelled, for those services to be brought back in-house, and for other local authorities who are considering similar outsourcing deals with Capita to kind of pause and think again, given the whole series of kind of problems I've had as part of this kind of supposedly groundbreaking outsourcing project in Margaret Thatcher's former...
Yeah, I was about to say Margaret Thatcher was MP in the Council of Barnet, and we were saying before that Mike Freer, the former head of the council and currently an MP, that he's the pound shop pinochet.
Yeah, it's been, you know, Mike Freer is an interesting character. I mean, he was, very obviously supportive of this Capita project. I mean, the very history of Capita is very interesting, right? So, you know, Capita was formed out of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, CIPFA, in...
These are the people that you referred to before that set the rules but don't enforce.
That set exactly, yeah. So they were created out of a body of public accountants. They kind of knew where all the money was. They had a kind of air of respectability about them. They were, you know, seen as knowing what
Hold
they
on
were
a
doing.
second. Hold on a second.
They were experts
Let me just slow down. So, Capita, who are known throughout the world for privatising and having outsourced government services, making money out of that, they were formed from the accounting board. The accounting board that sets rules but doesn't enforce them. And so they know all the loopholes.
Precisely. And it's actually worse than that, because CIPFA, part of their funding comes from corporate sponsorships. So they've told me at least 5% of their revenue doesn't just come from accountancy members who work in local authorities and pay fees to them. They also get subscriptions and donations from large corporates like Capita, RBS and Barclays, who sold these loans to the councils, and that makes up a significant component of their...
Have you been able to find out how much they get from Barclays and RBS and whoever else they...
They wouldn't tell me, but they said overall the amount is about 5% of their total revenue, which is probably quite a lot of money. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so the issue in Barnes is, Capita, which, is formed in the mid 1980s. Their first contract was with Bradford Council under Eric
Really?
Pickles.
So Capita's first contract came in Bradford under Eric Pickles. So who is Eric Pickles?
So Eric Pickles is a former Conservative MP. He's recently retired. In the 80s, he was a councillor in Bradford, and eventually was elected to become council leader, whereby he managed to force through one of the early outsourcing contracts, which gave Capita a foothold in local government in the late 80s. And so Eric Pickles was lionised by the sort of Thatcher Conservatives. He was parachuted into a safe seat as an MP. And then in 2010, when the Cameron government rode to power, he was elected as the Minister for Communities and Local Government, who set about implementing what we now know as austerity. And if you actually look at what Pickles did in Bradford during his time as council leader, it was a combination of cuts to funding, outsourcing, wholesale destruction of council services, anti-democratic enforcement of a kind of financialised neoliberal agenda, essentially a carbon copy of what was then done on a national scale in 2010. So Eric Pickles is, I would say, one of the major directing minds in terms of how austerity has been weaponised against local government in the UK since 2010. And one of the more destructive things he did was to close the Audit Commission. Now, the Audit Commission is like a government body which audits town councils. He abolished it, shut it down, which happened in April.
Okay, hold on a second. So the Audit Commission, I remember I read about this. I remember hearing that when they privatised everything in the early 80s, the plan to privatise everything, there was this document that we came across called the Omega Files that was published by the Adam Smith Institute in the early 80s. And it was almost like a Bible stroke blueprint where they said, we're going to privatise. They said denationalise. We're going to denationalise this, and this. And at the same time, they also said, oh, by the way, we'll set up this audit commission. And so I think that at the time, nobody thought it would do anything useful because it was supposed to oversee all of these new sectors that were supposedly free, open to new private companies.
Yeah.
But actually, it did occasionally do something useful.
Yes, I mean, one of the things the Audit Commission did was take this case against Hammersmith and Fulham, which resulted in all these speculative derivative contracts being deemed illegal. And so, in the first 5 years of the Audit Commission, there were 9 individual cases involving local authorities and companies that did business with them referred to the High Court because there was something dodgy going on. After the Audit Commission was abolished in 2015, we had what's called the Local Audit and Accountability Act, which created these things which are, Eric Pickles said what would replace the Audit Commission would be what he called armchair auditors. So local citizens, you and me, filling in to replace hundreds of professional accountants with all the administrative support of essentially a government department.
So does that mean that the document that you've just produced on Newham Council and Lobos is with the full backing? It's in the spirit of what Eric Pickles referred to, because you are an armchair auditor and you are in fact doing what he said would happen. Yeah,
I mean, what Eric Pickles wanted, I think, was a system of impunity where the large corporates who provide, let's face it, the majority of funding for the Conservative Party are free to plunder the public purse at their leisure. So he wanted a system of lawlessness at local council level, which is basically what he's got. And the defence against this, in Pickles' view, was, yes, people like myself who were looking at particular kind of issues that we thought were highly questionable. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, we have zero power to bring legal cases against these local authorities or the outsourcing
Okay,
companies.
okay. So I'm starting to get the picture. So,
but just to kind of put some numbers around that. So in the first 5 years of the Local Audit and Accountability Act, which replaced the Audit Commission, we know for a fact there's been more than 50 local residents and councils around the country. We've been associated with many of them who have put in complaints to the external auditors and said, look, this is highly suspicious. Let's take this to the High Court. Let's get a decision on whether or not this is legal. Of those more than 50, not a single one has been allowed by the auditors, people like KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Grant Thornton. Not one of these has been allowed to proceed to the High Court.
So hold on. You're talking about a series of complaints that have been made to the replacement for the Audit Commission. Now, question. If you know about all of these complaints, is that because you were orchestrating them, or you were part of the communities that were affected by these dodgy loans, and so you know about that? Because, I mean, I never heard it reported anywhere.
No, sure. I mean, there's been no coverage. But, just to say, we've been running a campaign which is about enabling local residents in councils around the country that we know through our research have LOBO loans, to provide them with the information and tools to challenge them by making an objection to the external auditor. So because we've been in communication with residents who have been finding out about this issue, local councillors, people who are concerned, and sharing information in these kind of networks, we're kind of across essentially kind of what's been going on. And we know, because we're getting information back from these local residents, that in many cases I've been waiting 2 or 3 years to get any sort of information back from the auditor. The auditor is essentially just whitewashing a whole series of dubious, potentially criminal actions by outsourcing firms, banks, brokers, advisors. And there's been, again, not a single case referred to the High Court, despite the fact that 15 of these councils are suing the banks. So how can you have a situation where a resident complains about something, the local authority agrees with the resident enough to take the bank to court itself, and yet you have an absurd situation, frankly, where the auditor says, actually, no, everything's fine here, nothing to see, move right along.
Have you got the names of these? Have you got the names of these auditors? The individual names? Because the whole point of audit is surely that the person's name is next to it, and they sign and they say, I'm telling the truth, everything is above board. They can't hide, can they?
Yeah. Sure, and just
so
an
you've got
example
signatures.
of who
You've got
these people
signatures
are.
of people that said there's no problem here, even though at the same time the council is suing the banks that lend them money.
Yeah, precisely. And they need to be held to account. But the problem is, in the small print of this Local Audit and Accountability Act, there's a gag clause. What that gag clause effectively does is, if the auditor provides you information obtained through their investigation through the audit, they provide that information to you as the objector, as a local resident. If you then share that information with someone, let's say a journalist, the auditor can sue you for an unlimited amount of money.
What if you are a journalist?
So there's an unlimited. There's no defence. So they can basically take your house off you for sharing information, which should be subject to any public interest defence, but because of the way this legislation's been drafted, the auditors have this kind of gag clause built in where they can essentially brush all the criminality under the carpet and scare the daylights out of anyone to prevent them from going to the press. And so rather than a Local Accountability Act, what we have is a Local Criminality Act, where essentially these corporates who do business with the council are free to plunder, safe in the knowledge that even if they get caught out by a local resident, there's very little that can be done about it. And so this entire local audit structure, which is supposed to be there to guard against plundering of the public purse, is achieving the complete opposite. And so I think this brings us back to people like Eric Pickles, who set up this legislation in the first place, to ask, what were their policy objectives when they closed the Audit Commission, who was lobbying them to do it, who benefits from a lack of accountability at local council level, where billions and billions of pounds of public funds are spent, and why aren't the media taking a more active interest in this sort of issue when so much public money is clearly at stake?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, it sounds like if Eric Pickles has opened the door to Capita and David Cameron is friends with Michael Spencer, who is the Tory treasurer, and Michael Spencer's made a lot of money out of this, then it looks like Eric Pickles, George Osborne, Mike Freer, and David Cameron have done a lot to promote austerity, gut local councils, and have them borrow money at usurious terms from banks and give all of this commission to these brokers. So it sounds pretty corrupt to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair summation of what's going on. I mean, how I've likened this is what we have is a series of policies which have basically turned your local council into a casino. So what these policies have done, they have reduced the income of the council, and so it no longer knows how much money it has coming in, when it's going to receive it, or whether their income is going to be sufficient to meet, frankly, kind of snowballing local demand needs, because everything else has been cut to the bone and people are skint. They need, they've got more complex welfare needs. And so basically what government's doing is creating a situation where councils are being forced through austerity and defunding to make increasingly desperate attempts to kind of plug that black hole in their budget elsewhere. And how they're doing that is they're borrowing more money.
Where from?
And they're borrowing more money. They're borrowing more money from banks and the sorts of people who donate lots of money to the Conservative Party.
Hold on. When and where are they borrowing? Because they're not borrowing now, are they?
They are borrowing billions of pounds now.
How?
So in the last year, councils have borrowed £10 billion pounds in the last 12 months. A large chunk of that is from the Public Works Loan Board, so government, and a lot of that has gone on to investing in commercial property, which brings us back to Steve Eisman and The Big Short. So basically what's going on is councils are being squeezed by central government, but they're being allowed to borrow, even though austerity was supposed to be about getting the debt down, if you recall. So they're borrowing more money than they ever have. And rather than investing in things like social housing, making sure our kind of services are working properly, keeping libraries open, stuff people need, instead what they're doing is they're trying to speculate in financial markets and in property to create income to make up for the lack of funding from government.
So they're paying for what are they buying?
Well, they're buying shopping malls, they're buying golf courses, they're buying hotels, they're buying commercial office space. One council, Spelthorne Borough Council in Outer London, bought BP's offices for $400 million just to lease it back to them. So basically these councils are buying infrastructure with minimal social value, and they're not doing it to make their residents' lives better. All they're doing it for is to create potential income to be able to kind of spend on the sorts of stuff they should be spending it on, like housing, like council services, like adult child social care. And so the risk here is that if, for example, in 3-4 months' time we have a hard Brexit, large amounts of companies relocate from London to Dublin to Frankfurt to Paris, what happens to commercial floor rent? Goes down. What happens to the price of property? Goes down. What happens to rents? They go down. And so these incomes the councils were told were basically stable and were going to make them a lot of money long term, suddenly could be cut by 30-40%. And at that point, rather than providing the council an income, what these so-called investments are going to be doing is sucking more money away from what the council is supposed to be doing, spending money on local services, and we're going to see more and more of these councils going bankrupt. And so basically what you're seeing here is the private sector, property developers, banks, offloading risk onto town halls, knowing that sucker taxpayers will be left on the hook to pay for it. And so I kind of liken this to a casino, except this is a casino where your local town hall finance director is not spending his own money. Ultimately, he's borrowing money from the banks, and we're going to be paying for it. So we've got problem gamblers running local authorities around the country, not using their own money, using public money. We've got no say at all in what these guys are doing, and when it goes wrong, we're expected to pay for it.
So what can be done?
And it will go wrong, because every other time
what can be done
wrong. Well, I mean, clearly we can't have a situation where you've got public officials who are able to just waste billions of pounds like this with complete impunity. So we need a system whereby local residents are empowered to take local decision makers to court when they're not acting in the public interest, and we need financial resources to hold them accountable when things go wrong. We need financial regulators like the Financial Conduct Authority to actually step in and regulate local authority finance, because at the moment they say, look, councils are sophisticated, they know what they're doing, we don't need to get involved in this. But yet time after time after time we see councils getting taken for millions of pounds by private actors. So we need, you mentioned kind of deregulation, and yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, what we need here is regulation in the public interest, and we need people working at these local authorities who are able to distinguish between corporate interest and the interests of their local residents. And if they're borrowing money, that money should be tied to a public purpose, like provision of welfare services, like provision of housing, not simply to speculate in financial markets or on property to make money. And so what we've had is a complete bastardization of the purpose of local government from something that is there to make residents' lives better, to a situation where these guys in the finance department just think they're a profit centre and their job is to make money through whatever means possible to keep the whole thing going. And so we need to repurpose local government so it's actually acting in the public interest.
I remember about 4 years ago, probably, I sent a Freedom of Information request to the Treasury, and I said, could you give me anything that you've got on these loans that councils are taking out from banks? LOBOs, lender option, borrower options. You know what they said? We have nothing.
We have it.
So it's fascinating how they act like they don't exist, and they don't do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean the Treasury is a huge part of this problem. I mean they enforced the policies that encouraged local authorities to borrow more from banks rather than from government. So like a lot of this debt we've been studying, that came from the repurposing of social housing in the late 2000s. And essentially what happened was the local authorities were told by the Treasury that, look, we're going to get rid of your public works loan board debt, we're going to refinance that using loans from banks. And the people who were advising the government on this stuff were coincidentally Ernst & Young. So Ernst & Young were Newham Council's auditors. They also audited Barclays at the time. And so again, there's this kind of nexus of corporate interests whereby one accountancy firm is basically telling government how local authorities should be kind of structuring their housing accounts, how they should be borrowing, and at the same time, miraculously, is supposed to be auditing Newham Council's accounts and doing this in such a way that it can tell us, look, these loans the council's taken out actually are a bit of a problem. Well, no, of course they can't. They were clearly just acting as agents for the bank, as agents for government, and what government wanted to do was get that debt off the public balance sheet. So in a way, this whole thing works a little bit like PFI, and that government's objective here was to say, look, we've got the public debt down because we don't count this bank borrowing in our books. And I guess that's why you got this response from the Treasury saying we don't know anything about this, because Treasury's rules mean they don't actually have to count when local authorities borrow from a bank instead of from government. And so I think you're right, there's this kind of nexus of corporate interest and government policymakers, which is about hiding what's actually going on, even if the impacts of kind of doing it this way in terms of who pays what are going to be far, far worse. We pay higher interest rates, we borrow for longer, there's more risk, but in a way Treasury doesn't care because it's not their problem.
So this is financialisation, but it's also kind of shadow banking, isn't it, in a way? I mean, it's unregulated, it's banks, but this is interesting actually. It's banks engaging in sort of non-banking banking, if you see what I mean. It's not above board banking that these banks are doing. what these banks are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think like shadow banking is a good way of describing it, and it's actually how I would describe it is councils acting like hedge funds. So banks are enabling your town hall to act like a hedge fund or a private equity firm, except the sorts of people who are going to be running your town hall have nowhere near the sorts of financial training and expertise that the people running hedge funds or private equity firms have. So they're trying to compete on entirely unequal terms, and surprise, surprise, every 10 years or so you'll see a major scandal where councils get completely cleaned up, lose a whole bunch of money, and the sucker taxpayer gets left paying the bill for it. And I imagine within the next kind of 2 to 3 years, we'll be hearing about this commercial property carry trade where councils have borrowed billions of pounds, piled into commercial property just before the bottom fell out of it, and now the rents they're getting from these things aren't even enough to pay for the loan, and they're going bankrupt. And so this is where we're going.
Can you tell me about three people? Michael Spencer, Tony Travers, Howard Davis. Any order you'd like.
Okay, so I mean, just very quickly, Michael Spencer, he was the CEO of ICAP. He now is, I think, CEO or chairman of NEX, which is like a successor.
Yeah, but he sold that now. He's moved on. He sold that now. Yeah.
So he was also the treasurer of the Conservative Party between, I think, 2005, 6 and 2010. So he was basically drumming up financial support for David Cameron's Conservative Party as he made his run for government. And yeah, so Spencer was kind of like the darling of the Conservative kind of party, a sort of godlike figure in the financial media because he essentially kind of created his company from scratch in the 80s, around the time of the Big Bang. But what a subsidiary of his was doing, which is a firm called Butlers, was advising these local authorities to, essentially speculate in financial markets. So when Iceland blew up in 2008, half the councils that lost money were actually advised by Michael Spencer's firm. So Butlers advised about, I think, 70 local authorities, and the majority of those lost huge amounts of money in Iceland. So he was responsible for about half of that £1 billion that ended up being lost. And as a result of that, and the fact that his firm ICAP were involved in rigging the LIBOR interest rates and another couple of associated rates like Euribor and ISDAFIX, when Spencer was put forward for a knighthood, that was kind of turned down. And we also think, part of the reason it was turned down is because, his firm was so closely involved with essentially asset stripping these local authorities and turning them into a speculative casino. Interesting guy, very successful, but, let's face it, he was able to operate within a system in which there was complete impunity from the law. So that gives you a slight advantage, you might say. Tony Travers, interesting character. He's a LSE professor. He has been, I think, probably quite close to Conservative local government over the years, but also kind of a friend of New Labour, which has been very comfortable with outsourcing and commercialisation as well. He's written a series of reports for Capita. He's a frequent commentator in the press, and I think he's an expert in appearing to be critical while creating political cover for councils to engage in undemocratic, outsourcing kind of projects which don't really benefit the public. So Travers is a kind of interesting character in terms of, local government statecraft in the same way kind of, Tony Blair was able to kind of force through an agenda. I think he's been quite effective in, allowing councils to behave in ways which 20 or 30 years ago would be unheard of.
So what do you mean that? Do you mean that somebody like that? Because I've had some interactions with him and talked about some of this stuff, and he just ran. So this is a guy who supposedly knows, how everything works. But when it comes to this topic that we're talking about, he just never said anything, did he?
Well, I mean, the key thing is, local authority finance, despite these councils essentially borrowing around about £90 billion over, so they borrow and invest huge amounts of public money. Despite that, there's almost zero media, academic, political attention on what these councils do. And so, I mean, to be fair, like Travers is probably one of a handful of people in the country that actually bother focusing on what's actually going on here. And so it's basically a vacuum where nobody really knows much about how stuff actually works. And so, you know, Travers is kind of like this convincing kind of puppet figure who's able to kind of, you know, go out into the press and put a nice shiny gloss on stuff and kind of like assuage any concerns people might have about what went wrong and who might be responsible, and just kind of, you know, brush it all under the carpet. So he's kind of like, you know, the perfect guy for excusing you know, ongoing malpractice by these town halls. And I mean, I think what this exposes the fact that we need much more people researching how these public bodies actually act, and much more transparency and accountability around who they do business with, how they do it, on what terms, and ultimately kind of who pays for stuff when it
Howard
goes wrong.
Davis.
Yeah, so Sir Howard, I mean, he used to be the boss of the Audit Commission, actually, which is quite interesting. So, you know, when the Hammersmith case played out in the 80s, he was the boss of the Audit Commission. So, started out in the public service, has been in academia. I think for a while he was actually the chairman of the Financial Conduct Authority. So
Yeah, it was the FSA, the
well.
Financial Services Authority. I think it was the first one.
Yeah, and so he's more recently he's kind of moved to become chairman of RBS, and he was in the media earlier this year on BBC Question Time when he referred to the private finance initiative PFI as a fraud on the people. And so, yeah, I mean, this guy is quite an interesting character. I mean, I think, absolutely kind of knows what's going on and how things work. Is able to articulate stuff very well in the press, but when it comes to actually acting against any of this stuff, you know, be it local authorities being defrauded by RBS in the form of Lobo loans, I mean, even though it's been pointed out to him personally by myself at AGMs, I mean, you know, Davis, even though he understands acutely what's going on, because of his experience with the Audit Commission, just refuses to lift a finger. And so, I mean, you know, you get these financial elites who basically just know everyone, they've got all their friends in high places, and they just feel insulated. And so, you know, again, even when banks do break the law, potentially when they do sell products which are clearly abusive to public sector clients, you know, there's no personal consequences at all for people like Howard Davis.
Okay.
So, you know, he can just kind of ride off and
just to get this clear, because now we are talking about it from the perspective of people who work in the banks. There are these structured product divisions in these banks like Barclays, RBS, and all these other European ones, such as Deutsche Pfandbriefe Deptford, the German bank in Ireland, that and they're only copying American banks from the 80s, but these structured products, these derivatives, they offload them onto councils, small businesses, and through infrastructure projects as PFI to the various departments of government. So as far as they're concerned, they're structuring these products, they offload them to these public bodies and small businesses and local governments, municipalities, and they get away with it. They've got all the tools to get away with it. And if you look at it from the perspective of them, they're just getting these loans and these weird derivative products out the door, and then afterwards everybody else is expected to pay them off. And if you make too much noise about the fact that you've been ripped off, you get gagged in order to get a couple of quid back.
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's a few legal principles here to kind of get your head around. So the first is this idea of the kind of regulatory perimeter, and this is, I think, something just concocted by UK policymakers, probably like Howard Davies and his kind of predecessor, Sir Philip Hampton, who himself was responsible for a whole swathe of government deregulation. And so basically what they've created is a kind of lawless zone where they can say this kind of pseudo-criminal kind of activity kind of falls into. And ultimately they kind of know, look, I'll be gone, you'll be gone, nobody's really going to lift too much of a finger to kind of hold any of us accountable. So just kind of move as much of this product as you can, as they did with like PPI and these big mis-selling scandals, get it out the door, and, you know, worst case scenario, we might have to pay, you know, 10% of the profits we made through illicit activity back at the fine. So, I mean, essentially we've just created a legal system where fraudsters are above the law. They're never going to be sent to jail for anything they do. The worst they'll face is a fine, which is a small proportion of the criminal profits they've made. And the media generally are not going to kind of connect the dots and sort of say, well, this is just part of a kind of ongoing national scale kind of crime wave. It's kind of like a one-off event, despite the fact these banks now have a kind of rap sheet, which is like, getting on to 4 or 5 feet high. So, I mean, yeah, we are in a curious situation where there seems to be no rules for the city, or if there are rules, no one to enforce them. And it is, full socialism for financial markets and cutthroat capitalism for town councils who are now increasingly going bankrupt.
Okay, so you said there were